and particularly last year when we saw the exemption on the NIC-CBA merger, something which many of us felt, I mean, the country couldn't afford this kind of exemption. Do you feel it was justified?
You see, Julian, that's even though we said that that's a political question, I think the first thing to understand here is that it's legal. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that exemption. If you look at the law as was amended, when you've got two businesses coming together, you can apply for an exemption and you will get the exemption. So in as much as we want to say that perhaps these businesses were owned by political or politically identifiable individuals, the fact of the matter is that the law provided for that exemption. As to whether we should have been getting that exemption in the first place is a question for Parliament, because why include that exemption there in the first place? And I think this goes back to the initial question that you had asked about why do we even have these exemptions? And Professor here alluded to the fact that we need to answer the question, are these exemptions achieving their intended purpose? I have no idea whether they are. However, my response to you, Julian, is that there is absolutely nothing wrong with that exemption.
But Robert, if you read the PFM framework, the values of the PFM structure in this country are very clear. One, it should be just, there should be equity in this. As to whether that was realizing equity is now the question here, because here we have two sizable banks, and clearly we are questioning just, I mean, can the country afford this? You know, that's a question which I think everyone can agree that this was not in the best interest of the public.
Well, first of all, if you talk about the size of these banks, if you look at a country like Nigeria, 21 banks, capitalization of about $1 billion each at a minimum. So I think as a country, perhaps even from a fiscal perspective, fiscal management perspective, this is something that we need as a country. So as to the question whether the country can afford or not, I guess that's a question for policymakers, because you are saying the law is that this exemption can be granted. And by the way, nothing stops any other person from seeking a similar exemption, provided you come within the law. Again, if we have a problem with that exemption, then perhaps, like you said, looking at this, reviewing these exemptions 5 years down the line or 5 years back, we need to say these things no longer work for us, and therefore we are stopping this. But again, if you do that, then the Kenyans that we are, we shall say, oh, this thing was just designed for this particular transaction, and look, now it's been reversed. So for me, I think, you can't win either way. Whatever way you look at it, you cannot win. But there's nothing wrong with that, in my view.
Clearly, Professor does not agree with you.
Yeah, she was my lecturer, and I'm sure she would not agree.
Clearly, I passed him. I shouldn't have passed him. I need to check his records and transcripts.
But now,
yes.
Please, Professor, you have something?
So let's think about it carefully, because we have a disconnect between our legislation and our constitution. I already mentioned earlier we have principles of public finance, but you can already see that when actions are taking place, whether it's cabinet or it's revenue collection purposes, it doesn't reflect on those principles when they are rolling out and enforcing. So we already have a disconnect between the two. So if you were to ask me, is there a possibility of a court case here? Absolutely. This is contestable. The question becomes, how did it get allowed? Why did it get allowed? And who allowed it? And I think that these are questions that become very important, because they got a waiver, but most companies don't get waivers. So it's not about anyone can apply. It is about who applies, who is successful, who is not, which is why, frankly, this audit of exemptions, I am super excited about it. I can't wait to see the list, because you will actually, I can promise you, you will see vested interests transmitting themselves in who has achieved it, and it will be the wealthy and the powerful who have access to the two gentlemen on either side of me, the very controversial Big Four accounting firms and others who have lobbying space and power to access those spaces. But if I were to set up a savings and credit cooperative society tomorrow, and my fellow Matatu driver sets up another one, and then we try and consolidate and then ask for you will not get them, because it's about the power and it's the game. Now let's come to another issue. He talked about Nigeria, so we really need to put that to bed. Yes, Nigeria has got 21 banks. And yes, a couple of years ago, I think it was a year ago, when central bank announced, the governor announced that he wanted consolidation of the banking sector. But the question is, why do you want consolidation? What is the purpose behind it? So yes, you can have consolidation, but you still don't need to get a tax break for it. You just do the consolidation in peace and collect your revenue. But why are we not looking at issues of anti-competition law? Because as you consolidate and you make banks bigger and bigger, you will also start to undermine the smaller banks that are coming up. And what we are doing is we are making bigger banks out of international ones, for example, but where is our homegrown? Now let's talk about the big four, because you talked about fiscal consolidation. The whole purpose of fiscal consolidation is to finance your big four. The whole purpose is to get money rolling into your economy and sitting there. But if you're making bigger institutions that are going to have bigger linkages outside, then first you've released the tax money, so you're not getting that. But the other part is that money is now flowing out of the economy. Because the whole purpose of your tax system should also be allow money to move in the economy. If people don't have cash in their pockets, then how are they going to spend? Okay. Right? And a lot of what we've been talking about has been unpacking it. Which comes to your last question is, can we afford this? No, we cannot afford it. The world is in a fiscal crisis. Francis is terrible today. We're in a fiscal crisis, so of course we can't afford it. Yeah. They have tripled their targets. We've been listening to the target amount so far. Please rationalize for me why we would be giving an exemption when businesses are shutting down, like Francis says, when we are not hitting targets like Robert says, and I'm waiting to hear what Churchill says to support me. This is what it is.
All right, and I want to push the envelope a bit because we're running out of time. But something very critical is happening. We have the Public Finance Management Amendment Bill before the House. And I want to start with Churchill here. There are a number of proposals in it. The first being that it wants publication of the debt register. What are your thoughts on this, Churchill?
It's a noble initiative in terms of publication of debt register, and in particular the external debt register. In terms of the domestic debt register, is something that's public knowledge. You can view it at the CBK website or NSE. Some of us who work in the capital markets, we get access to this data. But now the major elephant in the room here is now in terms of the external debt register, and in particularly what's been out in the public, SGR terms. We saw last year in October when this whole discussions about the public debt limit was being debated in Senate. Those are two-page external debt register, which to me was a big joke because it was lumping, say for instance, the multilateral lenders, the IFC, the World Bank, the IMF, and all those other multilateral lenders. And it's sort of now getting a one consolidated figure and getting the average life and something like that, or average interest rate, and also the average life to maturity, which is not helpful at least the best. And the last time we had a comprehensive external debt register was back 2014, 2015, thereabout, whereby it was looking at each and every loan that we have on the external front, line by line, is showing that if we have a loan that we got from China, Exim Bank, for instance, going to fund SGR Phase 1, it's giving us the terms and whatnot. So that's what even this Public Finance Amendment Bill number 4 is suggesting, that we need to get back to that area whereby we have a comprehensive public debt register. And this register will be coming 3 months at the end of the financial year, so that will be around September, thereabout. So that is quite a noble initiative. I hope it sails through as it is, rather than getting some complications in between.
Francis, on that?
Maybe, and yes, covered very well around the external part of it. The part which I want to mention is around the internal part of it. And I would like to mention the issue of pensions. Now, the government could not, I don't know where these, they have been taking that particular money for pension or setting it aside, because one of the causes of that is the government actually extended the retirement age from 55 to 60. Yeah. And one of the things which my understanding, if I can say so, is because they didn't have that money to pay the retirees. Yeah. So I don't know whether they are going to extend again to 80 years. So, but the figures which we are playing around here is about 1 trillion. And the IMF was very categorical around this particular issue. And they said, of course, if you look at the percentage we are looking for, GDP to debt ratio or debt to GDP, we're looking at 56. When you factor in the pension debt, if I can use that term,
Yes.
it jumps to around 69 or 70. You'd correct me if I'm wrong, which basically tells us that most likely that ceiling you're basically now getting to the infamous debt trap. So that's something I would like the policymakers to think about, because for me it's a debt.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the government might actually default in payment of pension.
Pensions.
Yeah.
I see. Professor, I know you have to leave a little earlier. Your thoughts on this issue of the PFM amendment bill, and especially this issue of the debt register?
So I think the debt register is a good thing. Again, I think transparency in a fiscal system is very important, and I think at least this is a positive thing government is doing. It is starting to be more transparent. It is still very poor at communicating to its people, but it's getting there. So you have to give them congratulations for that. But I am of the same opinion as Francis, that this question of what is the percentage and its lack of clarity is really problematic. 10 or 15 years ago, the maximum was supposed to be 40%. Before that, it was a 25%. Now it has moved to 60%. And every time you see economy starting to falter, when we're in a crisis, this ceiling seems to go higher and higher. And how do we justify it? I've heard somebody say you can even have 120. I understand Somalia has hit over 100. So, you know, when Francis talked about, here's your debt, here's the asset that is backing your debt, then when you lose out on the debt and you have to pay it back, you lose the asset. The question becomes, if you're hitting 60%, it means 60% of our land needs to be used to pay off a loan. If you look at the figures on the ground, I think we're hitting almost $1,800 per head. So every child born in this country is born in debt. We now have oil. But if you look at Norway, every child born is born a millionaire in dollar terms. I mean, these comparisons of your debt register must be linked in with the effect it has on the growth of your economy. If you're allowing your children to be born in debt, then we will never pay it off. And you know, we have sudden emergency debts. So we take on expenditures that are that emerge as we go along, and these are not yet being considered in this as well. So I think it's very important that, and I think somebody said it already, we must learn to live within our means. We must be very, very practical about it. And this crisis is lasting longer than the last one. It has spiraled much further down than the last one. So if you were to use a biblical phrase, although I am not Christian, it's the 7 lean years. We better figure out what we are doing with these lean years, and very, very carefully.
I see. And Robert, we must live within our means, and one of the proposals that we have, not necessarily in the proposed amendment bill, but came from the Treasury actually last year, is that we always have this problem in our budget cycle, where we pass the expenditure, then we start nursing the headache of, okay, how do we raise this revenue? And that is why we have the provision of the finance bill within 90 days. The proposal is that let's have these two documents essentially going side by side. We have the expenditure on this side, and we have revenue on this other side. What are your thoughts on this?
So for me, that's a brilliant proposal. And I actually remember sometime last year, we had this debate about when should these budgetary proposals be published. I agree with that. In fact, if you look at the amendments to the Public Finance Management Act that came out last year, I think last year September, the finance bill has to be approved by Parliament by 30th of June, so that 1st July, you're giving Revenue Authority ample time to collect the taxes. If you remember 2011, 2012, that Finance Act was actually published in January 2013, which means that for the taxes that took effect on approval of that finance bill, you basically had the Revenue Authority having 5 months to collect the tax, so it was impossible to meet those targets. So for me, I think that's a very good idea, and actually Uganda has tried it and it has worked perfectly, because what you see in Uganda is that finance bill is debated in March. Between March and May, it's debated by Parliament. So, you know, you've got all stakeholders giving their views. This is what we'd like to see. Parliament saying this is not going to work. You know, change this and the other. come 1st of July, Revenue Authority is ready to roll. As a businessman, between March when that finance bill is published and July 1st when it becomes law, you've got those 3 months to organize your affairs if you need to transfer or merge any businesses that you require, that kind of a thing. So for me, having that finance bill ready, Finance Act ready to go on 1st of July is perfect. Now, I just wanted to also add something to the earlier debate around fiscal consolidation and accountability. Transparency, which Professor alluded to. So one of the things that Francis talked about is accountability, and I think part of that debt register must tell us what is this debt going to do and how is it going to impact the economy, because we need to know that. And the other thing about it is, you might remember about 3 or so months ago there was a dispute between Treasury officials and IMF about whether we should include the guarantees that have been given by state corporations as part of debt. Now, if you include that and what Francis is talking about, that debt is possibly going to be about 80% of the GDP, which is crazy. And I know people have talked about Japan about 200%, but I don't think you can compare those two. One thing to note here, and the reason why this is such a critical issue, is that even though a lot of people don't have access, even I don't have access to those contracts, there's something called a cross-default clause. And that basically means if I default on her loan, then Francis's and Churchill's loans also become due immediately. So as a government, you cannot default. As a government, we cannot default. And that's the reason why everything else will stop, because we need to pay a loan. You cannot default on that. You can go and negotiate, renegotiate the loan, the tenor of the loan and all these kind of things, but you cannot default on that payment. So it's critical, and I do agree with that proposal that that debt register needs to be public. It needs to be interrogated by people so that we know what we're getting ourselves into. And the last point is, our current president, when he was Minister for Finance, he started austerity measures, because the fiscal consolidation is about expenditure cuts. So now if you look at today, nowadays I see fuel guzzlers on the road and I wonder what happened to the Passats. Austerity measures, I have no idea.
Consistency is the issue. but staying on the subject of, just what's happening within the public finance framework, some would argue that it is more than just a sequencing game. Okay, fine, you can pass this two side by side, but we've seen instances where, like last year, if you remember the division of revenue conundrum we had between the National Assembly and the Senate, and this protracted for a while, and we couldn't even, transact business because of what was happening. Francis, if I could get your sense, do you think perhaps more could be done in terms of streamlining how we go about this PFM framework?
I presume one of the things we have in Kenya and a bit of a problem is about egos. It's a country which is run through egocentric behavior. And one of the things which we would like to see is a team which sits down together, develops the programs together, and is consistent. And I presume when I was listening to my famous guy, the former PM of Singapore, he put it very, very clearly that you must be communicating with each other, you must be working together, and there must be consistency. And I think that is what is actually missing. One of the issues which has happened is around the PFM Act is the whole issue of the provisions which are there within the Constitution. It's Article 217 of the Act. So the team has come up with the proposals, and they have said this is the framework which we should be working within under Article 217. Now, when you look at that, the whole discussion around those particular frameworks put in place, everybody is pulling in their direction without agreeing on what has been proposed. So most likely it's about that consistency, and at the same time around you can come up with a framework which you can agree as a country. And you'll see senators pulling in one direction, the governors pulling in one direction, at the same time the executive keeps quiet. So it's what we like to say the resonance of decisions when it comes to the PFM Act, not everybody pulling their own direction without having a consensus.
Okay. I want to ask a question out of public interest and start with you, Churchill. We are getting into this budget cycle without an Auditor General in place.
It's a concern. And one of the things that also should be in place, if you look at even the county governments, they peg the 15% based on the latest audited financial statements.
Exactly.
So far, I think we are at 2016, 2017, if I'm not wrong. So ideally, with Auditor General in place, at least they can start auditing even the numbers for the government, which is also a basis for even disbursements to counties. So right now, I think it's based on 2016, 2017. So we have a lower audited base vis-a-vis, and all these numbers year in, year out, the revenue numbers keeps on coming up. So that's another negative item here. And also apart from that, also some of the public listed companies, they get affected based on this issue. And
because they can't release results.
Yeah, they can't release results. CBK also has its own results, is still pending, and there was a motion in Parliament late last year in regards to all these issues about Auditor General. So my feeling is it was known that the Auditor General's helm was coming to an end of August, but nothing was done about it. Right now, I think it's subject to a court justice, so that is quite a big injustice in terms of the public finance. Having said that, I would like to go back to that issue about the PFM Act and all this sequencing finance bill and also the appropriation bill, which had been tackled earlier on. And the big issue to me, I find it, if you look at the Finance Act, it's something now to ideally is to find measures of raising the tax revenues. And for the current financial year, we're looking at 37 billion directly to be raised from the Finance Act. But that said, we find that there are some other miscellaneous acts that are put in the Finance Act. And one of them in the current financial year was this issue about repealing of the interest rate cap rate. So we find that, yes, the Finance Act is supposed to raise some additional revenues. Of course, that we know that the other revenue measures are still ongoing, but now Finance Act is now to get some additional revenue measures. But we find that these other miscellaneous acts come into place, and those are the things that actually delay the process. We saw that the presidential reservation was not even on the 37 billion, the tax revenue measures, but on some other miscellaneous adjustments. So I think that's the biggest uncertainties with this Finance Act. And recall 2 years ago, we had what provisional collection of taxes, which was something interim measure for those when in those months whereby the Finance Act has not been passed, and some of the tax measures had to be infected in 1st of July, others coming in 1st of January. So at least that one was in place, but it was petitioned by Okia, Omtata, and then it was ruled to be unconstitutional. So you don't have that in place. So you find that now, at least with the PFM, Public Finance Act, being tabled in April, just before 30th of June, it's